sedatives leave a very specific taste in your mouth. A flat, metallic bitterness that clings to the back of the tongue, a chemical ghost that whispers of violation. It was the first thing Eliza registered, that and the brutal cold that had sunk its teeth into her bones. She had been left for dead, dumped in the frozen wilderness alongside her twin sister, by the one man who was supposed to be their guardian. Corbin Vance. The man who had smiled at their father's funeral, his hand a comforting weight on their shoulders, even as his other hand was busy signing the papers that stole their inheritance. He had left them here to be erased by the wind and the snow, a final, tidy loose end in his meticulous financial conquest. But Corbin had made one fatal error. He assumed that because they were women, they were fragile. He assumed that because he had their money, he had their strength. And he had forgotten about the secret their father had left them, a secret not of gold or land, but of numbers. A secret contained within a worn leather ledger that Corbin believed was ash, but which was, at that very moment, sewn into the lining of Anna's winter coat. Corbin thought he was burying a liability. He had no idea he was planting a seed of vengeance. And in the unforgiving soil of the high peaks, that seed was about to find the most unexpected nourishment. He had built his own tomb, he just hadn't realized he'd left the key with the women he intended to haunt it. The cold was a predator, and they were its intended prey. But even predators can be outsmarted. Even the most carefully laid plans can unravel with a single, overlooked detail. For Corbin, that detail was the simple, unbreakable fact that he had left them alive. Anna came to consciousness slowly, a painful crawl from a drugged abyss into a world of biting agony. Her first sensation was the rough texture of frozen earth against her cheek, each tiny pebble a point of exquisite pain. A low moan escaped her lips, the sound immediately snatched away by a wind that howled like a starving wolf. She tried to push herself up, but her limbs were heavy, unresponsive logs of flesh. A wave of nausea, thick and cloying, rolled through her. She fought it down, focusing on the one anchor in her swirling disorientation, her sister. Eliza. Her voice was a dry rasp, barely audible over the gale. She saw a shape a few feet away, a huddled mound of dark wool that was barely distinguishable from the rocky ground. Panic, cold and sharp, lanced through the fog in her mind. She crawled, her fingers numb and clumsy, scraping against ice-sheathed stone. Eliza, wake up! She reached her sister, shaking her shoulder. For a terrible, heart-stopping moment, there was no response. The cold had made Eliza's body terrifyingly still. Anna shook her again, harder this time, a desperate sob catching in her throat. Finally, a groan. Eliza's eyes fluttered open, glazed with confusion and pain. Anna. The name was a puff of white vapor in the frigid air. They clung to each other, a small island of shared warmth in an ocean of lethal cold. The world around them was a brutal panorama of grey rock and skeletal pines under a sky the color of bruised iron. They were high in the mountains, far from any town, any road. The tracks of a single heavy wagon, already beginning to fade under a fresh dusting of snow, scarred the ground nearby, the only evidence of their arrival. Corbin's wagon. He had driven them up here himself, under the pretense of taking them to a new homestead, a place to start over. He had offered them coffee from a flask on the journey. Coffee laced with laudanum. It was a clean, simple plan. No witnesses. No bodies to be found until the spring thaw, if ever. Just two orphans, lost to the unforgiving wilderness. He had taken everything from them, their home, their name, their security. And now, he had tried to take their lives. As they huddled together, the full, crushing weight of their situation settled upon them. They had only the clothes on their backs. No food, no water, no tools, no fire. Just the biting wind and the rapidly falling temperature. Survival wasn't a matter of days, it was a matter of hours. The first hour was a desperate, stumbling march against the elements. They followed the wagon tracks, not with any hope of catching up, but because it was the only sign of human passage in this desolate landscape. Every step was a battle. The thin mountain air burned in their lungs, and the sedative's lingering effects made their movements clumsy and uncertain. Eliza, always the more physically robust of the two, took the lead, breaking the path through the deepening snow, her face set in a grim mask of determination. Anna followed, her mind, usually a sharp, orderly place of figures and calculations, now a chaotic storm of fear and fury. Her father's ledger, sewn into her coat, felt like both a dead weight and a sacred charge. It was the proof of Corbyn's treachery, a detailed accounting of every dollar he had siphoned from their father's businesses, every forged signature, every falsified deed. It was their only weapon, but it was useless if they froze to death on this forsaken mountain. By the second hour, the snow was falling in thick, blinding sheets. The wagon tracks had vanished completely. They were lost. The wind drove ice crystals into their faces, stinging their exposed skin raw. They found temporary shelter in the lee of a massive granite boulder, pressing themselves against the stone, trying to shield each other from the relentless assault. The cold was a physical presence, a monstrous entity that leached the life from them. Shivers racked their bodies, violent and uncontrollable. They knew the signs. First the shivering, then the numbness, then the fatal, sleepy calm. They had to keep moving. They pushed on, driven by pure, primal instinct. It was during a moment of near despair, as Eliza was scanning the bleak hillside for any possible break in the terrain, that she saw it. A slight, almost imperceptible anomaly. A patch of earth on the steep slope, just below a rock outcropping, that was unnaturally flat. It was sheltered from the worst of the wind, and the snow there was thinner, as if melted from some subterranean warmth. It was nothing, likely just a quirk of the geology. But it was different. And in their situation, different was hope. They scrambled toward it, their movements clumsy with cold. As they got closer, Anna noticed something else. A rusted iron ring, almost completely buried in the frozen soil and camouflaged by a dead, thorny bush. It was a handle. With numb, fumbling fingers, they clawed at the dirt and ice around it. They pulled together, their combined strength barely enough to budge it. With a groaning scrape of wood on stone, a section of the hillside lifted away, revealing a dark, descending stairway. A door. A heavy, planked cellar door, set flush with the ground. The air that wafted up from the opening was stale and musty, but it was degrees warmer than the blizzard outside. It was a tomb, a cave, a mystery. But it was also shelter. Without a moment's hesitation, they descended into the darkness, pulling the heavy door shut behind them, sealing off the howling wind and plunging themselves into a new, unknown world. The darkness was absolute, a thick, velvety black that swallowed all light and sound. The sudden silence, after the constant scream of the wind, was jarring. The air smelled of damp earth, cured wood, and something else, something savory and preserved. They stood trembling on the rough-hewn stone steps, their eyes struggling to adjust. Eliza fumbled in the pocket of her coat, her frozen fingers searching for the small match safe she always carried. A habit inherited from their father, who insisted a lady should always be prepared. Her hand shook so violently it took 3 attempts, but finally, a tiny flame sputtered to life, a fragile star in the immense blackness. She lit the wick of a nearby lantern that sat on a wooden crate, and a warm, golden light bloomed, pushing back the shadows. What it revealed made them both gasp. They were in a large, subterranean room, part cellar, part bunker. The walls were lined with sturdy, packed earth shelves, and those shelves were laden with a fortune of survival. Tins of salted beef and smoked fish, jars of peaches and pears suspended in syrup, sacks of flour and beans, barrels of salted pork and pickled vegetables. There were stacks of thick wool blankets, crates of lamp oil, tools, and even a small cast-iron stove with a pile of seasoned firewood beside it. It was a prepper's dream, a fortress against the apocalypse. It was salvation. For a few minutes, they were simply overwhelmed with relief, the tension draining from their bodies in shuddering waves. They were safe. They were warm. They would live. They greedily opened a jar of peaches, the sweet syrup a shocking, delightful explosion on their starved palates. They wrapped themselves in the thick blankets, the rough wool a comforting weight. But as the initial shock of their discovery wore off, a new, chilling realization began to creep in. This wasn't some long-forgotten pioneer's root cellar. The supplies were too new, too well organized. The tins were free of rust, the labels clean. Then Anna saw it. Burned into the wood of a large crate was a set of familiar initials, C.V. Corbin Vance. The blood drained from her face. She pointed, her hand trembling. "Eliza!" "Look!" Eliza followed her gaze, and the same cold dread washed over her. They began to search the room with a new, frantic energy. They found a half-empty bottle of expensive whiskey on a small table, Corbin's preferred brand. A box of his favorite cigars. This wasn't just a shelter. This was his shelter. His bolt hole. The place he would come if his world ever came crashing down. The irony was a bitter pill. The man who had left them to die in a blizzard had inadvertently provided them with the very means of their survival. The relief they had felt moments before curdled into something else. Something harder and colder than the mountain winter. It wasn't relief anymore. It was opportunity. This place wasn't just a shelter, it was an armory. And they were no longer just survivors. They were soldiers in a war Corbin himself had declared. The discovery that they were inhabiting their enemy's private sanctuary transformed the very air in the bunker. Every tin of food, every log for the fire, was a resource stolen back from the man who had stolen everything from them. The fear that had gnawed at them for hours began to recede, replaced by a slow-burning, intensely focused rage. They spent the next day methodically taking inventory of their new domain, their actions precise and purposeful. Eliza, practical and strong, secured their position. She used a heavy iron bar to brace the inside of the heavy cellar door, making it impossible to open from the outside. She inspected the stove, ensuring the flue was clear, and started a small, efficient fire that finally chased the last of the deep-seated cold from their bones. The warmth was more than just physical, it was a psychological victory, a reclamation of comfort and control. While Eliza fortified their physical space, Anna's sharp mind went to work on the strategic implications. This bunker wasn't just a hiding place, it was a reflection of Corbin's own paranoia. He had built it to be self-sufficient, to be isolated. He had stocked it with everything he would need to wait out a storm, whether that storm was literal or financial. It was his escape plan. And in the center of the room, bolted to the floor, was the heart of that plan, the heavy, iron strongbox. It was locked with a formidable-looking keyhole, a silent testament to the secrets it held. Getting it open became their singular obsession. It took them the better part of a day. They used a crowbar and a small sledgehammer from the tool pile, working in shifts. The metal shrieked in protest, the sounds echoing in the confined space. Finally, with a deafening crack, the lock mechanism shattered. They lifted the heavy lid. Inside, there was no gold, no jewels. There was something far more valuable. It was Corbin's entire life, distilled onto paper. There were neat bundles of cash, a significant sum, but that was the least of it. There were property deeds, for their family's ranch, for the town bank, for half the county, all fraudulently signed over to his name. There were copies of telegrams, outlining stock manipulations and bribery payments to land office officials. And at the very bottom, tucked inside an oilskin pouch, was the document that made Anna's blood run cold. It was a draft of a new will, supposedly signed by their father on his deathbed, leaving his entire estate to his trusted partner, Corbin Vance, in recognition of his loyal service. It was a masterpiece of forgery. But next to it was Corbin's personal ledger. A book not unlike her father's, but its contents were monstrous. In it, he had meticulously documented his scheme, a sociopath's diary of conquest. And on the final page, an entry dated the day before, for the sisters' final disbursement, High Meadow. Expense, 1 wagon, 2 blankets, 1 flask laudanum. Account closed. He had recorded their murder like a business transaction. They had found the gun, the bullets, and a signed confession. And in a separate, lead-lined box, they found a telegrapher's key, a set of code books, and blank bank drafts from a dozen different banks. Corbin hadn't just built a shelter. He had built a command center. A place from which he could operate, untouchable. He had given them everything they needed not just to survive, but to dismantle him, piece by treacherous piece. A profound and terrifying calm settled over Anna. The grief, the fear, the shivering vulnerability of the past 2 days solidified into a single, sharp point of purpose. She spread the contents of the strongbox across the rough-hewn table, the lantern light casting flickering shadows on the architecture of their ruin and their revenge. Her father had not just taught her sums and figures, he had taught her the language of money. He had shown her how a single misplaced decimal, a cleverly worded clause, or a well-timed wire transfer could build an empire or shatter one. She looked at the bank drafts, the telegram forms, the deeds, and she did not see paper. She saw weapons. "He runs everything through the telegraph office in 3 Rivers, Anna said, her voice devoid of emotion. "All his instructions to his bankers in Denver and San Francisco. He uses a cipher." She picked up the code book. His own private cipher. Eliza watched her, a fierce pride mixing with her own cold fury. She saw the familiar look in her sister's eyes, the same intense focus she'd had as a girl when solving a complex mathematical puzzle. But this was no puzzle. This was a demolition. "What are you going to do?" Eliza asked, her voice low. "Corbin thinks we are a liability he has written off his books," Anna replied, her fingers tracing the forged signature on the fake will. "We are about to become a debt he can never repay." The counterattack began not with a bang, but with the quiet scratch of a pen on paper. For 2 days, Anna worked relentlessly. She studied Corbin's handwriting from his ledger, practicing his sharp, arrogant loops and slashes until her own mimicry was perfect. She cross-referenced the telegrams with the code book, deciphering his system, learning the secret vocabulary he used to move his stolen fortune. She wasn't just imitating him, she was becoming him, a phantom version of Corbin Vance, wielding his own authority against him. Her plan was audacious in its simplicity. She would not merely steal the money back. She would make it look as if Corbin himself was liquidating his assets in a panic, transferring vast sums to untraceable accounts, and then disappearing. She drafted the telegrams with surgical precision. The first set went to his bankers, instructing them to sell off his shares in the railroad and the mining syndicates, at a loss, if necessary. The language was urgent, panicked, citing a sudden and catastrophic turn of events. The second set of telegrams, sent to a different set of financial institutions, instructed them to wire the resulting funds to a series of smaller, independent banks under newly created accounts that would be impossible to trace back to him, or to them. The final, and most brilliant, stroke was a telegram addressed to the federal marshal's office in Denver, written as if from a panicked, anonymous clerk in the 3 Rivers land office. It hinted at massive fraud perpetrated by a wealthy land baron, Corbin Vance, who appeared to be fleeing the territory. She included specific details from the ledger, facts only an insider could know, lending it an unshakable air of authenticity. She was not just ruining him, she was building his cage. With the documents prepared, the next challenge was transmission. They were trapped in their subterranean fortress, miles from the nearest town. The telegraph key in the box was useless without a line to connect it to. Leaving the shelter was a risk they couldn't afford. Corbin might return, or they could simply perish in the wilderness, their carefully crafted revenge dying with them. For a day, they were stalled, the meticulously forged papers sitting on the table, inert and powerless. The solution, like the shelter itself, was an unexpected discovery. While organizing the firewood, Eliza noticed a persistent draft coming from the back of the woodpile. She moved the logs aside and found a small, square opening near the ceiling, covered by a loose-fitting iron grate. It was a ventilation shaft, no wider than a dinner plate, cut through the earth and rocked to the surface. It was far too small for a person to climb through, but it was a direct link to the outside world. It was their mail slot. Anna remembered the mail rider. Old Man Hemlock, a creature of unwavering habit, who rode the high trail from 3 Rivers to the mining camps once a week. His route, a faint track barely visible from their hillside, passed within 100 yards of their position. He was their only hope. They spent the next 2 days preparing. They bundled the telegrams and the bank drafts into a tight roll, wrapping them in a piece of oilskin from the strongbox. They needed to ensure Hemlock would not just see the package, but would be compelled to investigate it. Anna penned one final note, this one in her own, desperate-looking hand. It was a plea for help, claiming to be from two sisters whose wagon had overturned, one of them badly injured. It begged the finder to take the enclosed, urgent business telegrams to the office in Three Rivers and send them immediately, promising a handsome reward upon their rescue. She included a roughly drawn map, pointing to a fictitious location a mile down the mountain from their real position, a clever misdirection to protect their sanctuary. They tied the oilskin package to a fist-sized rock with a long, brightly colored strip of fabric torn from a blanket. On the day of the mail rider's scheduled run, they waited. The hours crawled by. Finally, in the late afternoon, they heard the faint, rhythmic sound of hoofbeats crunching on snow. Peering through a tiny crack in the cellar door, they saw him, a lonely figure on horseback, silhouetted against the winter sky. It was now or never. Eliza scrambled to the ventilation shaft. "He's approaching the bend," Anna whispered hoarsely. Eliza gauged the distance and the angle. She swung the rock back and forth like a pendulum, building momentum. "Now!" With a grunt of exertion, she heaved the package up and out through the shaft. It sailed in a high arc, the red fabric fluttering, before landing with a soft thud directly in the middle of the narrow trail. They watched, hearts pounding, as the rider approached. He reined in his horse, his gaze fixed on the strange object in his path. For a long, agonizing moment, he simply stared at it. Then, slowly, he dismounted, picked it up, and began to read the note. For days passed. For days of agonizing silence and suffocating suspense. They rationed their food and lamp oil, speaking only when necessary, the unspoken question hanging heavy in the air between them: did it work? Had the mail rider believed their story? Had he sent the telegrams? Their entire future rested on the actions of a stranger. They existed in a state of suspended animation, trapped between a past that had tried to kill them and a future that was utterly uncertain. On the fifth day, their vigil was rewarded. They heard the familiar hoofbeats of the mail rider's return journey. He stopped at the same spot on the trail, but this time, he wasn't just passing by. He dismounted and left a small bundle on the ground where their package had been, a newspaper and a small sack. After he was gone, Eliza retrieved it, her movements quick and furtive. Back in the bunker, they tore open the newspaper, its dateline from Denver. And there it was. A small article on the financial page, under the headline "Vance Holdings in Sudden Collapse." It described a panic sell-off of Corbin Vance's assets, with market analysts speculating about a massive, unforeseen debt or a sudden flight from justice. It mentioned that federal authorities had been alerted to irregularities in his land office filings. It was working. A slow, grim smile spread across Anna's face. The first stone of the avalanche had been loosed. The sack contained a few tins of food, a block of cheese, and a short, scrawled note from Hemlock. "Sent your wires. Marshals are looking into it. Hope you ladies are all right. Left you some grub." He had believed them. He was helping them. This small act of kindness from a stranger felt like a miracle. Over the next 2 weeks, the pattern continued. Every few days, Hemlock would leave a newspaper, and with each one, the story of Corbin's downfall grew. His accounts were frozen. His businesses were in receivership. The U.S. Marshals had officially opened an investigation, and Corbin Vance was named as a person of extreme interest. The narrative they had crafted from their underground prison was becoming reality. The news painted a picture of a man unraveling. Corbin, from his grand house in Three Rivers, was issuing frantic denials, but his actions, or rather, the actions of his phantom double, spoke louder than his words. He was trapped, his wealth evaporating, his reputation in tatters, the walls of the law closing in around him. And he had no idea where the attack was coming from. The newspaper quoted him as being baffled and besieged by an unseen enemy. He would never suspect the truth. He would never look for his enemies in the one place he felt safest. He believed they were bones, whitening under the snow. His arrogance, his fatal underestimation, was the true weapon. He began to grow desperate. He was a cornered animal. And cornered animals, they knew, always returned to their den. The air in the bunker grew thick with anticipation. They knew he would come. It was no longer a question of if, but when? Corbin, stripped of his financial power and facing federal prison, would become obsessed with the loose end he thought he had tied. He would need to return to the high meadow, to the scene of the crime, to reassure himself that his secret was safe, that the dead remained dead. His paranoia would drive him back to the very place where his ruin had been plotted. They spent their time preparing for his arrival. They were no longer victims waiting for rescue, they were predators laying a trap. Eliza reinforced the bar on the door and practiced extinguishing the lantern and moving in the pitch darkness, her movements becoming silent and sure. Anna reread every document, every telegram, committing the details of his crimes to memory until she could recite them like scripture. They were two halves of a single entity of vengeance, their purpose clear and unyielding. The sound came on a moonless night, 2 weeks after the first newspaper had arrived. A crunch of boots on the frozen snow, heavy and angry. Then, a scraping sound at the cellar door. He was here. They extinguished the lantern, plunging the bunker into absolute blackness. They stood side by side against the far wall, their breathing shallow, their hearts hammering a silent, frantic rhythm against their ribs. They heard him grunt with effort as he tried to lift the door, then curse when he found it wouldn't budge. A loud thud followed as he slammed his boot against it in frustration. Silence. Then his voice, low and menacing, cut through the night. Is anyone in there? He was probing, testing. Maybe he thought a squatter had found his hideout. Anna remained silent, holding her breath. Eliza's hand found hers in the darkness, a small, reassuring squeeze. He kicked the door again, harder this time. I know you're in there. This is private property. Come out now. His voice was strained, the arrogance laced with a new, raw edge of desperation. He was a king who had lost his kingdom, and he was furious. This was the moment Anna had been waiting for. She moved silently toward the door, her footsteps masked by the thick dirt floor. She pressed her lips close to a small crack in the wooden planks. Her voice, when she spoke, was not the voice of a terrified victim. It was calm, measured, and utterly devoid of fear. It was the voice of a creditor calling in a debt. It's barred from the inside. Corbin. The silence that followed was profound. It stretched for what felt like an eternity. They could almost hear the gears grinding in his mind, the frantic denial warring with the impossible truth. When he finally spoke, his voice was a choked whisper. No. It can't be. You should have made sure we were dead, Anna continued, her tone as cold and flat as a banker's ledger. That was sloppy. A strangled sound, half sob, half scream, came from outside. You? It was you. How? You left us your ledger, Anna said, savoring each word. And your codebooks. And your bank drafts. You left us everything we needed to close out your accounts. All of them. He began to pound on the door, his blows raining down with mindless, animalistic fury. The thick wood shuddered but held firm. You won't get away with this. I'll kill you. I'll burn you out. His threats were hollow, the impotent rage of a man who had already lost everything. He was the one trapped now, outside in the cold, while they were safe inside his own fortress. The power dynamic had been irrevocably, beautifully reversed. And then, through the sound of his frantic pounding, they heard a new sound. The distant but distinct thud of approaching horses. Many of them. Anna allowed herself a small, cold smile in the darkness. The marshals are here, Corbin, she said, her voice a final, devastating blow. I do believe they have some questions for you about all that money you seem to have misplaced. The pounding stopped. Corbin stood frozen outside the door, his chest heaving, his mind finally comprehending the full, catastrophic scope of the trap he had walked into. The sound of the approaching riders grew louder, closer, the crunch of hooves on snow, an inexorable drumbeat of justice. Blue-coated figures on horseback emerged from the trees, their forms stark against the pale winter landscape, rifles held at the ready. They had been led here by Old Man Hemlock, who had finally reported the strange circumstances to the authorities, his report corroborating the anonymous telegram from Denver. They surrounded the cellar door, their movements professional and efficient. Corbin Vance, the feared land baron, the untouchable titan of 3 rivers, looked like a wild, cornered thing. His fine clothes were disheveled, his face pale with shock and fury. When the lead marshal dismounted, his voice was calm and authoritative. "Corbin Vance, you're under arrest for fraud, conspiracy, and suspicion of murder." Corbin didn't resist. The fight had gone out of him, replaced by a hollow, vacant look of utter defeat. As the marshals clamped irons on his wrists, Eliza slid the heavy iron bar away from the door. She and Anna pushed it open, emerging from the darkness into the cold, clean light of dawn. They were thin, pale, and weary, but they stood tall. They were not the broken, terrified girls Corbin had left for dead. They were survivors. They were victors. Anna held out the 2 ledgers, her father's and Corbin's, to the marshal. "I believe you'll find everything you need in here," she said, her voice steady. The marshal took the books, his expression a mixture of awe and respect. He looked from the composed young women to the now sobbing wreck of a man being led away, and he understood. He had not come here to rescue victims. He had come to witness the conclusion of a reckoning. They watched as Corbin was placed on a horse, his head bowed in shame. As the posse led him away, his empire reduced to a single, shackled man, the first rays of the morning sun broke over the mountain peak, flooding the meadow with golden light. It was the end of their long winter and the beginning of a new day. They had lost their father, their home, and their innocence. But they had reclaimed their future, paid for not with money, but with resilience, intelligence, and an unbreakable bond. They had been thrown to the wolves, and they had emerged leading the pack. This story is a testament to the fact that the most dangerous thing you can do to a person is underestimate them. The sisters in this story were stripped of everything, but they never lost their ingenuity and their will to fight back. They turned their enemy's greatest strengths, his wealth, his meticulous planning, his private fortress, into the very tools of his destruction. If you found their story of survival and calculated revenge as compelling as I did, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more true tales of incredible resilience. And let me know in the comments below, what was the single most satisfying moment of Corbin's downfall for you? Was it the discovery in the strongbox, or the final confrontation at the cellar door? Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.